Assalamu alaikum dear students. Today we are going to study another important sensory tract which passes through the spinal cord. So we can call it ascending tract. We have already studied the dorsal column medial lemniscal system, and today's topic is spinothalamic tracts, also called as anterolateral or ventrolateral system. There are two important pathways or tracts which are included in the system: the anterior and lateral spinothalamic tracts. Why do we call them spinothalamic? Because these tracts, they start and travel through the spinal cord and go to the thalamus and then to the brain. So we call them spinothalamic tracts. The anterior spinothalamic tract passes through the anterior white column of spinal cord, and the lateral spinothalamic tract passes through the lateral white column of spinal cord, as compared to the dorsal column tract, which passes through the dorsal white column of spinal cord. The receptors for this spinothalamic tract are mostly free nerve endings, the ends of type A delta and type C nerve fibers. You know very well that in sensory classification, type A delta fibers belong to group 3 and type C fibers belong to group 4 nerve fibers. These first order neurons have their cell body present in the dorsal root ganglion. The central axon goes to the posterior gray horn of spinal cord, where it finds its relay, the first relay or the first synapse in the dorsal horn of spinal cord. In the dorsal horn of spinal cord, in laminae 1, 4, 5 and 6, there is synapse between first order neuron and the second order neurons. As soon as the second order neurons start, they cross towards opposite side. So in this case of spinothalamic pathway, the crossing over of signals occurs at the level of spinal cord. In case of dorsal column pathway, this crossing over occurs in medulla. The signals are transmitted at a speed of 1 to 40 meters per second along these nerve fibers. So you can see here the velocity of conduction is much slower as compared to the signals which are conducted in the dorsal column pathway, where the signals are conducted at a speed of 30 to 120 meters per second. The sensations carried by this pathway are crude touch, crude pressure, pain, temperature, tickle and itch, and sexual sensations. These second order neurons cross from one side to the other side at the level of anterior commissure of spinal cord. So you can see here the signals from this side will cross to the other side at the level of anterior white commissure, and then on the other side there are two tracts present: the anterior spinothalamic tract and the lateral spinothalamic tract. Crude touch, crude pressure, the tickle, this kind of tactile sensations which are crudely localized are carried by the anterior spinothalamic tract. Lateral spinothalamic tract carries the sensations of pain and temperature. A useful mnemonic to remember the sensations carried by the lateral spinothalamic tract is patella. In this mnemonic, PA is for pain, TE for temperature, L is for lateral. Pain and temperature are carried by the lateral spinothalamic tract. The importance of signals crossing from one side of spinal cord to the other side is that if there is a lesion to this pathway in spinal cord, because signals immediately cross to the other side, so loss of sensations will not be from the same side. If cut in this pathway is on left side of the body, the sensations carried will be lost on the opposite side of the body, because second order neurons immediately cross from one side to the other side in the spinal cord. These second order neurons ascend through the opposite side of spinal cord and then through the brainstem, that is through medulla, pons and midbrain. In medulla, the anterior and lateral spinothalamic tracts are joined by a spinotactal tract to form another lemniscus, which is called as spinal lemniscus. So at the level of medulla, we see a spinal lemniscus which is made by three tracts: the anterior spinothalamic tract, lateral spinothalamic tract and spinotactal tract. When these signals are passing through the brainstem, the fibers are given to the reticular nuclei in the brainstem, and these tracts are called as spinoreticular tracts. This is clinically very important because one very important sensation carried by this tract is pain. So whenever, let's suppose, we are having pain, those pain sensations either coming from the somatic areas or from the visceral areas, these pain signals will be given to the reticular formation. So when reticular activating system is activated, this sends signal to our cerebral cortex through the thalamus, and then we become aroused. And this is the reason why when we are having severe pain, for example kidney pain, if that pain is not relieved by some strong painkiller, we are not able to sleep, because these pain signals, they go along the spinal reticular fibers to the reticular nuclei. Reticular activating system is activated, and then the signals from here go to the thalamus, and then from thalamus to the cerebral cortex, which is activated, and we are not able to sleep unless our pain causing stimulus is removed or we take strong painkiller. These second order neurons synapse in the thalamus at two important nuclei. One is the ventrobasal complex, where VPL is an important nucleus, and VPL is the same nucleus, ventral posterolateral nucleus, where the fibers of dorsal column pathway make a synapse. And another type of nuclei here are intralaminar nuclei and the thalamus, where the fibers coming from the reticular nuclei make a synapse. The third order neurons start from the thalamus and they project to the cerebral cortex, where fourth order neurons are present. In the cerebral cortex, the post central gyrus or area 312 or area S1. The primary sensory cortex is the area where the fourth order neurons are located. The primary somatosensory cortex S1 and the secondary somatosensory cortex S2 are important for perception of the signals, which are important for discriminative features and also for localization. For example, for the localization of pain and also for localization of the heat and cold signals. Some other parts of the cerebrum also receive these signals, like cingulate gyrus, amygdala, frontal lobe, and some other parts of the limbic system. And these are important to appreciate the motivational and affective features of pain. For example, in response to pain, sometimes we cry, we may feel punishment. So, this type of affective and motivational components of pain are perceived in the cingulate gyrus, the frontal lobe, amygdala, and some other parts of the limbic system. Now let's study what happens if primary sensory cortex is damaged. There is much more effect on the sensations which are carried by the dorsal column pathway as compared to the sensations which are carried by spinothalamic pathways. So the sensations for which precise localization is required, for which perception of fine grades of intensity, so those sensations which require perception of rapidly changing stimuli like vibrations and movement across the skin, such sensations will not be perceived properly if the primary sensory cortex is damaged. And also the perception of change in the weight and also the perception of texture, this kind of sensations will be lost if there is damage to the primary sensory cortex. However, the sensations which are carried by the spinothalamic pathway, they are not much affected. The perception of pain and temperature is still intact. It means that the pain and temperature, they also have subcortical centers like thalamus, like reticular nuclei, especially the pain. However, in case of these sensations, their localization will become poor. So localization cannot be perceived. So it means even those sensations which are carried by the spinothalamic pathway, they also require the intact primary sensory cortex for them to be precisely localized. Now let's compare the features of spinothalamic pathway with those of dorsal column pathway. The receptors in dorsal column pathway are more specialized, well developed. Most of them are having connective tissue capsules. For example, Meissner's corpuscles, Pacinian corpuscles. Here the receptors are relatively less well developed. Most of them are free nerve endings. The nerve fibers in the dorsal column pathway belong to category 1 and 2 are A alpha and A beta types of nerve fibers, and here in this case the nerve fibers belong to category 3 and 4 or A delta and type C nerve fibers. Type C are unmyelinated fibers and type A delta they are smaller diameter myelinated nerve fibers. So the velocity of transmission in these nerve fibers which carry the signals of spinothalamic pathway is much slower, 1 to 40 meters per second, and the velocity of conduction in case of dorsal column pathway is faster at a speed of 30 to 120 meters per second. Dorsal column pathway carries those sensations which require perceptions of fine grades of intensity like light touch, light pressure. But the sensations carried by this pathway, they do not require perception of fine grades of intensity of a stimulus. Dorsal column pathway can appreciate rapidly changing stimuli like vibrations, but not in the spinothalamic pathway. The sensations of dorsal column pathway, they are much better localized. So this is why the 2-point tactile discrimination is the sensation which is carried by dorsal column pathway, very well developed in our fingers. And the sensations which are carried by the dorsal column pathway, they are fine touch, fine pressure, vibration, movement across the skin, graphesthesia, stereognosis, and vibration sense, and 2-point tactile discrimination. And the sensations carried here by the spinothalamic pathway are crude touch, crude pressure, pain, temperature, tickle and itch, and the sexual sensations. Sometimes there are injuries to spinal cord. One typical type of injury to spinal cord in which half of the spinal cord may be damaged is called as Brown-Sequard syndrome. Now let's see what happens in Brown-Sequard syndrome when there is clear-cut hemisection of the spinal cord. Let me tell you, the clear-cut section of the spinal cord is very rare. However, this kind of syndrome may occur when there is damage to the half of spinal cord by tumors, ischemia, herniation of the disc, or trauma. Let's suppose on this side there is hemisection of the spinal cord. So what will happen to the tracts which are present on this side, and what will be the sensory and motor effects? On this side, the spinothalamic pathways, if they are damaged, because these pathways, they will be crossed fibers coming from the opposite side. There will be loss of all the sensations carried by the spinothalamic pathways, and they're coming from the opposite side. So on right side, if there is damage to the, so if on right side there is damage to half of the spinal cord, spinothalamic pathways are damaged, and the sensation carried by these pathways, they will be lost on the opposite side of the body, 1 or 2 segments below the level of lesion. And on the same side or ipsilaterally, there will be loss of sensation which are carried by the dorsal column pathway, because in the spinal cord the dorsal column pathway is still not crossed. So it's very important point to remember, because this dorsal column pathway does not cross to the opposite side in the spinal cord. So if the right half side of spinal cord is cut, sensations like fine touch, vibration, proprioception will be lost below the level of lesion on the same side or ipsilaterally, but the sensations carried by the spinothalamic pathway will be lost on the opposite side, 1 or 2 segments below the level of lesion, because the spinothalamic pathways, they have been crossed from one side to the other side. In Brown-Sequard syndrome, there are also motor deficits. The corticospinal tract, which we still have to study, when it's passing through the spinal cord and it is damaged, there will be loss of motor signals on the same side of body, because the corticospinal tract, they have already crossed. So because of damage to those corticospinal tract, there will be upper motor neuron type of lesion on the same side. So just to summarize, in case of Brown-Sequard syndrome, loss of sensations of the dorsal column pathway will be on the same side of lesion. If on right side, so dorsal column sensation will be lost on the right side, and the spinothalamic sensations will be damaged on the opposite side, 1 to 2 segments below the level of lesion, and the motor signals which are coming along the corticospinal tract will be lost on the same side below the level of lesion, because the corticospinal tract, they have already been crossed. So this Brown-Sequard syndrome illustrates an application of the crossing in both of these tracts, the dorsal column pathway and the spinothalamic pathway, and also the motor effects because of damage to the corticospinal tracts. In our next lecture, we will study this sensation of pain in detail. I have already mentioned that pain is one of the sensations for which we usually seek clinical advice. So we will study this pain sensation in a little bit more detail in our next lecture. In the next lecture, I will explain that there are two types of pain, and for them there are two types of pain pathways. For fast pain, there is neo-spinothalamic pathway, and for slow pain, there is paleo-spinothalamic pathway. We will discuss various features of pains, the differences between these two pathways, and also various pain control mechanisms in our body in our next session. So thank you so much for watching this video. See you next time with another video.